Thanks, Mark, and thanks for that lovely introduction. You'll get your free copy of this a lot later. And thanks everyone for coming today. I've got to say, after doing so many virtual conferences, it is just really lovely to be in front of a live audience and, you know, and not have the audience on their keyboard doing their email. Well, I'm watching a couple of you now as we speak. And for those of you in the other rooms, well, enjoy your email as well. Mark and others have already warned that I tend to run over time, so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I could speak on this topic for about 3 days, and would love to, given half a chance, but I'm just going to rattle through a few ideas and give you a couple of takeaways here. So the first one, there will be some free stuff at the end, and I don't have a raffle ticket. So basically the best question, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about this material later on to have a think about it, so this will hopefully get you to pay attention. What I will do though is a really gnarly trick of consciousness. I'm going to ask you to think for a moment, what's the biggest issue you're facing right now? And ideally frame it into something positive, like I would like more clients, or I need more funding, or I need to find a consultant to help with X. So what is the problem you're facing right now? Is it I want to get promoted? Is it a career question? Is it what education should I do? Which branch should I be in? So just give it a couple of seconds thought, because what that will do is put that in your subconscious, and you'll find somewhere in this presentation, I guarantee it, the money back guarantee, you'll find the answer to what you're looking for. This conference is free, isn't it, Mark? Yes. Good, thank you. So I want to quick just set the scene a little bit, and you know, a lot of what Jeff said really resonated with me in terms of enterprise and the broader picture. But we're living in an era now of unprecedented prosperity, peace, security, and longevity. We've experienced the biggest stock market boom in history, driven by a couple of main factors being demographics, with the baby boomers growing and going through that process of buying houses, cars, cutlery, crockery, new TVs, etc. And they've also been promised a lifestyle that they come to an age where that stock market is full of baby boomer pension funds. And it's also been expanded by the millennials coming into an era of unbridled credit. So, you know, the environment we take for granted now is unusual. The ability to get credit to borrow houses, to get more money. And that's the good news. Now the bad news, and you know, security people, we focus on the bad news because we pay attention to it, because it's important to the job we do. We're experiencing this period of pandemic, and you know, I think in some ways COVID is a good thing. Something that the Jakarta embassy received during the process of Timor being helped by the Australians to be liberated, or whatever the correct term is there. Some Indonesians took offence to this and fired pot shots at the Australian embassy in Jakarta. In response, the Australian government hardened all the windows with ballistic glass. A few years later, and a massive bomb goes off. Luckily, nobody actually inside the embassy was killed, and a lot of the reason for that was that we had ballistic glass. Now, it isn't blast-resistant glass, it's on the glass filling, but in preparing for one environment, one problem, they have responded to the next one. I think COVID gives us this opportunity. So I mentioned that there's unprecedented prosperity, and we've got this pension, defined benefits pension scheme. There's a couple of people in the room old enough here to know what a defined benefit is, and even to have a scheme there, people nodding happily. Future generations will be lucky to have even government pension, and their pension is based on superannuation defined on their contributions. And as the baby boomers retire, they're taking money out of the stock market. You know, the millennials are facing a credit crunch. These are just sort of things. We're actually facing possibly certainly the worst pandemic for 100 years, possibly the worst depression coming our way in 100 years. We're also in a state of flux with financial markets and macro level. When we talk about inflation, we think inflation is low at 2%, but this is just measuring inflation of bread and milk and petrol. Money is being printed at an unprecedented scale, credit is being spun up. You know, the American government is now at 2.7 trillion in debt. And if you look at the projections and you map other models, it basically gets towards 9 trillion in debt. In fact, even the Congressional Budget Office has said by the year 2050, the national debt for the United States will be 200% of GDP. Now, the IMF says 77% you're in trouble, the World Bank says at 120% you're basically bankrupt. And the more money you borrow is actually not stimulating the economy anymore. But the reason the US dollar isn't devaluing is a lot of reasons for that whole other topic. But part of it is that everybody's printing money. And what you see is the US dollar isn't going down in value because Australia, the euro, all those countries are printing more money. We're all devaluing. Inflation is going in the stock market and in the range of financial assets, and we're creating a bubble. Now, the only things which aren't going up are things like gold and Bitcoin, which are reasonably confined. Bitcoin especially is only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoins. Now, gold has increased 30% against the dollar in the last 12 months. Bitcoin has increased 90%. So we're seeing this sort of hyperinflation, some areas deflation, reflation. We're seeing a fundamental change potentially in our financial systems, which is great, okay? Except that when you think about the financial impacts, you know, we've got potentially civil unrest and even global conflict on the port bow. And I'm not saying we're heading for that, but it will only take a short course direction that way. And we are, you know, all the governments, the Five Eyes, we're all preparing at a military level. Defence is preparing for a conflict with China, potentially with other nations in about 10 years' time. We're all gearing up for this possibility happening. And when you think about the IRA, the troubles in Northern Ireland, you know, we talk about the great policing work that was done, the great military work that was done, but they didn't shoot the IRA out of existence. They didn't imprison them out of existence. Wealth, when the Celtic Tiger, as it was called, that economic boom in Ireland came along, you know, Paddy had a job and he had a family to feed and he had overtime shift on Saturday to buy a new TV or go to a car. He was too busy doing these sort of things and being wealthy to go out and raise funds for the cause, much less take up arms. And so when you think about this whole process of a possible, the worst depression in years, you know, we're facing some work where security practitioners and professionals really, you know, our work is going to count more than ever. Because, and this is one of the reasons I come and speak at conferences, not for the glory and the fame, despite Mark's kind words about being a global, what was it? You know? Thank you. That one. You know, it's really because I think there's so much that I'd like to share, and I think it's, you know, part of it is sharing here between each other, not just the speakers, because we need to be on our best game. We need to be delivering what we can. So this is part of what I want to talk about today. Now, I'm going to also mention this whole idea about nanotechnology, robotics, genetics. We're in a game changer. There's a generation of kids who don't remember the first computer coming in the house. There's going to be a generation of kids soon who don't remember the first computer chip implant, you know, live streaming Google. We've got artificial intelligence running our elevators and all sorts of things. Our smartphones have AI. The next step is artificial general intelligence, where you're talking about, you know, IBM Watson and what have you, where they can solve their own problems, learn their own solutions. But when we get to artificial superintelligence, that's an order of magnitude above where we are. And the first nation or corporation to develop artificial superintelligence, which can then make its own even smarter robots, even smarter artificial intelligence, even better. A 6-month lead in artificial superintelligence is like Manhattan Project. It's like global supremacy in the nuclear weapons race. So we're coming into this era. So that's the bad news. It doesn't get any simpler with the Internet of Things. IP version 6 is giving us basically what 2 to the power 128 addressable IP addresses. When you leave a few alpha gateways and reserved areas, that's the number of unique items which can have an IP address and be connected is 42 with 36 zeros after. So every product that is built for the next 10,000 years basically can be connected to the network. Your shoes, you know, forget your smartphones, your toaster's going to be talking to your shirt and telling you they're noticing you're coming home. So this web of interconnectivity is going to go beyond anything that we've ever thought about before. So, you know, I get to define cybersecurity, which is great. Now, this is a slightly different model from PSPF and a couple of other models, but in the security risk management body of knowledge, we looked at these 4 elements. We separated, you know, no surprise, physical and personnel, but we separated ICT from information, because information still comes on paper, it still comes in our heads, it still comes in papers, all sorts of sources. And there's obviously an overlap. The information is held on a technical, on a server or in some other electronic form or a blockchain, right? But I'm going to argue that there is a new world we need to think about. And I've called it cyber here, but it's network or it's integrated security or whatever. And this is the world where we have this IPv6 where security comes together, where the enterprise is no longer independent from the world. The enterprise may be a nation state for that matter. So not just a government department or a corporation. We are connecting everything. I'll use an example, a really simple example here. If someone uses social engineering, breaching personnel security, to find out the information about where the source code is kept for, let's say, driverless cars, and they find out, they get access to this, and they get into it with a zero-day attack or whatever it might be, and they take over a fleet of driverless vehicles. They start to weaponise this to run over pedestrians, to cause gridlock, to cause all sorts of things. It's no longer enough to say these are separate domains. I'd argue, I'd say that there's a whole new level of expertise of practitioner, and nobody knows everything about cyber. Anybody who says they do is either lying to themselves or lying to you. But we need to have people who, and people in this room and the other room, sorry, who are just listening to this, we need to be thinking about this integration of everything that we do and the implications that come downstream from it. So this is just one set of headlines from one newsletter I get, a fellow called Dina Vanderstock, who writes security newsletter. This is just a series of headlines of cyber attacks that have happened recently, that are in the public domain. So every single day we are getting hit with a whole range of these things, which have downstream real-world consequences for budgets, for reputations, for employees, for jobs. It's not going to go away. It's getting bigger. I'm focusing a little bit here on cyber, but I'm going to come back to the whole enterprise. And I'm very much an evidence-based guy and an action kind of guy. I love the theory, it's great. But what I care about is the action and how do we turn it into something you can do. So this is what I want to probably have a crack at providing for you now. So imagine we're having a bit of a fireside chat, we're just mates with a glass of wine around a fire, or maybe working on a project. Some of the things that keep coming up in conversation with my clients and indeed security professionals are these topics that I'm going to talk about today. I'll cover off on each of them, but really this is a couple of models and a couple of ideas that have been useful for me, and hopefully will help you solve some of your problems or take them away. And just a quick one to give you a bit of an insight into how I look at enterprise security risk is to consider the difference between a security risk assessment and an enterprise security risk assessment. And with a simple risk assessment, your policies, procedures, legislation form part of the context. They're your criteria. You're assessing based on those sort of things. With an enterprise security risk assessment, those policies and procedures and all the machinations that go around that are fair game. They become part of what's going on. So it's the difference between doing a Shell service station versus the entirety of Shell, thinking about how that works. So when we talk about enterprise, we can talk about the scope in various ways. You might do an enterprise security risk assessment just on physical. You might even have your enterprise security risk management separated in physical security and a CIO who manages security. Now, I'd argue that we need a chief security officer who manages all of that. But equally, you can look at some of this stuff in terms of, are we talking about the organisation, we're talking about a facility, or perhaps the Middle East. We can talk about enterprise at any level, and it's up to you, and the same context applies. But the point is, it's very important to separate. You might have a project, a new submarine acquisition project, and I've done risk assessments for $300 million projects. The North West Shelf Gas project, I did an enterprise security risk assessment for. Just a project, a subset of Shell and Woodside, $24 billion. So this idea of enterprise is flexible, but the context of defining it and saying, well, what is it that I'm actually looking at? And indeed, a lot of people in this room either are or work in the space or have worked in the space of national security. And I would argue you can think of Australia in this context as an enterprise. So don't just separate out, it's my business or it's my organisation. We're all doing it. We work for multiple employers as well. So it's not as if we're going to be entire life in one job. My view, enterprise security risk assessment covers all of this. Every domain should be considered because, as I said earlier, you can no longer separate them. And indeed, I'd take it up a notch and say that there are connections at the enterprise, that everything needs to be connected. So how does safety fit with emergency, with financial resources? How do all these things integrate? How does security add value to these? And where do you scope it? I'm going to come to something that Jeff mentioned, alluded to. It's a model of 3 types of risk management. So the first one is called procedural. That's called procedural risk management because I named it this morning at 8 a.m. when I was finished this presentation. But essentially, this is risk management, things which we understand, we can reasonably control. This is insurance, safety management, engineering. Mean time between failures when you're building a car or a gas plant. And this is the law of large numbers. This is where we have good data and we can model it and we understand what's going on. Now, active risk management is this competitive risk management where we are interactively involved, maybe a financial market, project management, where things can and will go wrong with unexpected competitive forces at play here. And this is the law of the land. This is where you're facing lawful legal competition and you're facing some interesting analogy. You have to be net fleet of foot, but really, you're still working within a nice framework. This is the place where security professionals play. Adaptive, adversarial, asymmetric. These are the characteristics of the risks that we face. And it's also with military, law enforcement, the whole range of geopolitical risks. But ultimately, this is the security space where we're dealing with somebody who is out to get us. The bad guys are watching what we do. And the old model of put a lock on the door doesn't work because the bad guy's going to climb over the door. This is a different way. This is one of the tools that are often used to explain risk management to people and talk about the relationship with risk, security, safety, all these elements. There's another model I find really useful. This is the rock pool model of risk. And we all know bow tie and Swiss cheese, everybody. You don't have to raise hands. Obviously, everybody knows these models. If you don't, ask me later. So I like models. So I invented a new model to think about what is enterprise security risk management. Because I've had this conversation with a lot of clients, a lot of bosses, even some security professionals, and the idea of enterprise security risk assessment feels to people that we should put somebody on every door. We should go and do a risk assessment of every facility we've got around the globe, and we need to be constantly thinking about it. We need reams of paper of security reports. Well, that's playing whack-a-mole, and that's death by 1,000 cuts trying to do that. And what I propose is you think about a topographical overlay. And so this is, imagine we're walking, we're not in camp at the moment, we're in the same tropical beach, we're strolling down the beach having this conversation, and we come to this beautiful tidal pool. Now, inside that tidal pool, there are rocks you can stand on to get a better view, to get on the high ground. There are also holes you can trip, you can find a stonefish in a hole, you can break an ankle. To make it nice and safe, you can just dump a truckload of sand in here, and that's great. It'll be nice and level, no risk. But firstly, that's an enormous waste of resources that we simply don't have. Secondly, the tides of change will come. New technologies will come. Geopolitical tensions will come. Trade wars will come and sweep all that sand back out. But if you think rather the topographical model about what are our security standards? So if someone works in Sydney, we'd like them to be equally safe when we send them to the pool. Whichever part of town or country of the world they're working in, they should have reasonable merits of safety because we have standards based on threats. And sometimes you'll look at these ideas and you'll say, well, we've got all of our network is protected to massive encryption, big Cisco routers, this big 2048 encryption on everything. And then we send someone out to work in a remote office and we give them a domestic grade router and say, there you go, connect that to their network. Well, what have we done? We've just built this overkill in our main office and we've got an underkill here. So if we take one of these big Cisco routers and the metaphor is rolling a rock of over treatment into that hole to fill that up. So reallocating resources before we even think about bringing fresh buckets of sand to fill the holes. So that's my mental model for enterprise security risk assessment, the topographic view, and there's a whole lot in SRM block and other stuff that I've written about. But that's how I try to explain it to people. Now, usually also when I talk about enterprise security risk assessment, enterprise security risk management, I talk about the tactical process, and that's how do we do a risk assessment. But there are actually 4 processes at play here. There's a strategic process, an operational process, the tactical one that we normally talk about, and there's a background process. Now, the strategic process is looking at taking governance to objectives, thinking about how this fits in, how does security integrate into my organisation, how does it add value? And this is the role of a good CEO, an MD, a secretary of a department. Their job is to make decisions to allocate resources. And this is the strategic overlay of enterprise security risk management. If you don't have that in place, a good conversation with those leaders and they have a good understanding and have the rock pool, whatever model you want to use to help them understand it, resourcing is what drives it. And that's the strategic level. Now, the operational, or I should actually say, just part of the strategic model is coming to conferences like this where serendipity fits in. And this is the idea of building into your whole network of, peers, coaches, mentors, friends, colleagues, trusted advisors, consultants that you know, bosses that have helped you out. This is building your little network as part of that strategic process. But in that, there's an operational process. And this operational process is sort of an abstraction. And you think about, I'll use a model of if you're going to do an enterprise security risk assessment, the same principle applies when you're triggering, when you're managing. You're scoping what needs to be done. You're investigating by looking at previous incidents. You're getting threat assessments. You're looking at what's been happening in the past. You're talking to and interviewing leaders and stakeholders and managers who have the experience and advice. You're analysing the information you get, you're treating or proposing treatments, and then you are presenting that data back. And this is the part that often gets missed in this constant idea of presenting what's happening, is it being effective, what's that threat level happening now. This is the interactive conversation, and it's more than just stapling some material together or creating a PDF. It's about getting in the mind of people in a way that, and I'll give you a link, and I'm very much an evidence-based guy. I'm going to give you a link at the end of this to a lot of information where you can go into more depth about it. But this is the idea of persuading and persuading and encouraging people to be influenced in the way you want them to be, which is to think about security more meaningfully to access it. Now, tactical processes very quickly are the operational process at the pointy end. These are what we do when you do a risk assessment or when you manage risk. So it's ISO 31000, there's the security risk management body of knowledge, and you've always got inevitably a custom process. I don't think anybody here has ever said, yes, this is exactly the process for, from this book and I'm going to use that. We need to build our own and adapt. Now this big, beautiful, messy diagram in the left here is the security risk management body of knowledge, the SRM model. And the bottom right there is the ISO 31000 process, which is basically, most of us know it's identify, assess, treat, and then you've got this monitor and report and communicate and consult going around continuously. Now on the left-hand side of this large messy diagram, we have those elements from ISO 31000. So it's a scope, context, criteria, identify, analyse, treat. On the right, we include those bars and monitor and report, communicate and consult. In the middle, and I could do a presentation on every single word in that diagram, every single square. So don't worry about it too much, but what it looks like is this. Essentially, we're looking at threats, we're looking at vulnerability, we're looking at criticality, we're analysing that, we're producing a risk treatment plan, and then we're dealing with residual risk. So that's the tactical process, and that's a whole, we tell you how long it takes and how much it costs and what's involved and what have you. That's a discussion by itself. But here's a process we often overlook in enterprise security risk management. I've yet to see it documented properly anywhere because we don't think about it. If you go out and procure an enterprise security risk assessment, or you decide you're going to implement a program of enterprise security risk management or treatment, you actually have this going in the background. It's so time consuming. Ask yourself how much paper exists just on the procurement step. And even if you're not going to an outsourced provider, you have to go around and schmooze the various department heads and friends and colleagues and say, I need this resource, I need that person, I need to use that room. You are building a lot of time into this stuff that never gets documented. Scope, plan, execute it, and review it. So these are kind of the processes, I think about the 4 processes of true enterprise security risk management. Now we talk about culture. I told you I was going to cover a lot of ground here, didn't I? Culture is one of these things that feels like we need risk culture, we need security culture, and that's kind of where the conversation starts most of the time. If you get a bit more in depth, people will say, culture, look, new leadership will change the culture. We need a new CEO or a new secretary. Change the government will change the culture. It doesn't, we know that. There's another school of thought that says you can change culture in a weekend. You get 5,000 employees into an auditorium and you change the culture. Yeah, all of that counts to a certain extent. But there's one truism that I found that really actually does work to change culture, and that's training. Now, this is this idea, training changes behaviour, behaviour changes attitude, attitude changes culture. And that seems pretty simple, but there are 2 ways that training changes behaviour, and the whole range of cognitive biases come into effect here. The first one with training is that people don't judge what is important by what you say is important. They don't even judge it by what you do. But people know time is precious, so they judge what is important by what you spend your time on. So if you spend all your time sending emails to your employees saying you're really important, or it's important that you do security risk analysis, you're actually going to assume that email is more important than security risk analysis, because that's what you're spending your time doing. And inherently we know this, so by sending someone along to, and I'm talking a 3 or 5 day training, a nice residential course for 3 days or something like that, where you really immerse people and you give them some tools, just that act of taking them out of the office and putting them into training alone says that this is important in ways that no amount of words can do. The second way it works is that when you have this many tools to choose from, when you get a problem, you choose from one of these. But if you take people on a training journey and you give them this many tools, they will choose from a wider range of tools, and they're more likely to choose the right tool or the right approach or the right concept to deal with this particular challenge at the time. And when they do that, they behave differently because they're using a different tool. And the beauty of this is this wonderful thing called cognitive dissonance. So we find it hard in our minds to believe that we would do something wrong. So if we do something, part of our brain says, well, we did that because it must be the right thing. You know, it's like when you get offended at somebody, you go, well, I'm justified in being offended because he thought right that day, you actually realise that you weren't. But we can use this same tool. Now, if people are doing a risk assessment, whether it's a complex one or a simple one, or whether they're thinking about security risks or they're working on a construction site, putting on a high-vis vest. I mean, imagine 40 years ago, I worked in the mines and construction, you wore sand shoes and, if you wore high-vis, you'd be called a sissy at best, It was like, what do you know? Well, you're not a real man, So now you go on a construction site and you would never dream, if you walk on there without a hard hat, and high-vis, you'll be issued that because the blokes, these rough, tough construction workers go, mate, not good enough. We can do the same thing in our security space, We allude to this importance that Jeff was talking about, getting people to understand it's not just about money, because they spend their day thinking about money. If we can get them to think about security and we can give them the tools to do it, we change the culture. Now, it's not quite that simple. You need objectives, you need a good thorough training needs analysis, then you train, you look at behaviour, attitude, culture. Then performance comes out of that. You get performance, and performance, you get the outcomes. So that's the journey to making security, enterprise security, a real thing, and not just a promise or lip service. There's another wonderful model called the Kirkpatrick 4 levels of training. And it basically goes, level 1 is reaction. It's the smiley face. So at the end of the day of training, did you enjoy it? Was the coffee good? Yes. 8 out of 10. Level 2 is a transfer of knowledge. And so that's most easily assessed by the start of whether it's an hour or a week of training. You might give people 20 multiple choice questions and say, right, answer these. So on day 1, the first minute they walk in the door, they get 12 out of 20 right. On day 3, as they're leaving, you give them the same test, and they get 18 out of 20. That's your transfer of knowledge. You measured it in that training context. But then these other nice levels, which people rarely fund, the really clever organisations like this, changing behaviour in the workplace means going into the workplace maybe 6 months after the course, so whatever period of time is appropriate to what you're trying to achieve. And you start to see, are people doing risk assessments? Are they speaking about risk at their meetings? Are they doing the things we asked them to do or we wanted them to do when we set the objectives? And then level 4 is results. Maybe 18 months after the training, you go into the organisation and you have another look and you say, we measured a happy face, we measured the transfer of knowledge, we measured the behaviour, but now are we seeing the results? Is the place safer? Are our incidents going down? Are we having less attacks? Are we better optimising our CCTV systems? Are we doing the things we wanted to do with this training? Now, I'd actually encourage you, by the way, to think about that model in terms of everything, really, not just in training, but every little thing. When we do put in some sort of new security upgrade, or we look at identity management, whatever it might be, access control, are we starting to see those 4 levels of transformation in the organisation? So some other stuff, because I said I just couldn't really fit everything in. This little risk matrix is not an analysis tool. This is a conversation tool, a thinking tool, a prioritisation tool. You'll see consequence on this x-axis, right here on the y-axis. In the bottom left corner, we're thinking about this business as usual idea. Now, depending on your context, business as usual might be petty theft. If you're a chain of department stores, you're not going to get wrapped around the axles. You know there's going to be some shoplifting, and you just manage it with routine procedures and processes. And then you look at, routine is the next one up, which is likely but minor. I've used an example here, which is fraud. So this is, let's say, bank. I was talking to someone in a bank recently talking about fraud, and this is a global phenomenon. No particular country doing it. They know this is routine part of business, and it will happen, and it will cause some impact. The danger zone at top right is an area where we have a high likelihood, high consequence. This is an existential threat for our organisation. Now, I would like to think that there are no organisations out there which are actually still operating there because they don't operate for very long. These are the risks that should already be treated or at least being targeted for more work. Swans, everybody knows about black swans. I take it, raise your hand if you don't, and I'll tell you about black swans. Yeah, famous book on the topic. NASA Talbot's book before that, I think, Thrill by Randomness was even better, but the idea of the black swan is unexpected events, sorry boss, I couldn't predict that. I like the idea of black swans, but I think it's lazy thinking. I think they're just swans. You know, we have white swans, we have black swans. Somewhere out there are red swans, green swans, and blue swans. So RIP the black swan. It's not good enough anymore to say, oh, sorry, boss, that was a black swan, I didn't see it coming. You know, Jeff alludes to this whole idea of aircraft flying into buildings. Yeah, we like to refer to 9/11 as a black swan. It wasn't. It was predictable. It was, you know, people in the industry understood that this was a real risk. And so it's political thinking or it's cozy. So we need to build stuff which factors in resilience. It's like the all assets concept we do with bushfire management. First aid. We need to be thinking about causal chains, and I've got a whole topic on that. A lot of people have written on what's wrong with risk matrices. A fellow called Tony Cox popularised that, and well, it's an interesting academic paper, and I think it has some merit to it. It's worth reading. Doug Hubbard is another fellow who is very much anti-risk matrices, and there's some good reasons they do talk about. A couple of other chaps did some research looking at amalgamation of risks in the oil and gas industry and how risk matrices and their assessment actually made things worse. Now I have a couple of counters to that, which I'll come about. The first one is that risk matrices are very popular. They are easy to understand. They're easy to use. They're not perfect. But when you start talking about this kind of Monte Carlo modelling, probability distributions, you are talking, firstly, an order of magnitude of expense and complexity. Secondly, in the security space, you're talking about something we don't have known probability distributions for. Monte Carlo modelling is wonderful, and I love it, and in the right place, it's a great tool. Basically, you look at, let's take this, bottom right corner is talking about toxicity, let's say chemical in food. What's your body weight? How often do you eat this food? And then you might say, well, this is skewed left, this is skewed right, this is normal skewed. So, people who are larger body mass will probably have less effect and so forth. And you can create this kind of idea. And this curve that you see here is actually one from a risk assessment that, I'll leave the chap's name out of it. But there are 4 risks here being modelled. And the 4 risks that are being modelled to give you this sort of probability distribution, their idea is they're saying the probability of the inherent loss exceeding $10 million is 2.3%. That's not super helpful when we've got an adversarial threat. We've got someone who's actually actively trying to overcome our barriers. It doesn't give us the information we need. And 4 threats that are in the modelling here come back to the main issue I have with the criticism of risk matrices. These 4 threats they're modelling are described in 7 words. One of them is a 1-word threat, a 1-word risk. And I'll talk about why that is. But this process, so what's the likelihood of the event? We don't know. It starts at $1 million. What if it never happens? It's a zero cost, isn't it? So that we're not really addressing adequately the chance of not happening. We're not talking about a time frame. We're talking about a very expensive proposition which may or may not deliver value. It needs you to have enough data already to work out distribution models, frequency distributions, and the risks data. And I'll come to this big hole in the One of the risks in that model is called data breach. Okay, great, a data breach. It's an event, it's not a risk. You can't model or calculate what is the threat, the risk, the consequence of that data breach, because let's just take the asset. What data are we talking about? This is a case that one I use for writing 1-sentence risk statement. So you think about what's the asset? Is it data, client data? Is it medical data? Is it financial data? Is it personal information? What's the source? Is it foreign intelligence services? Is it Russian mafia? Is it hackers? Is it a skill kit? Is it inadvertent accident? They're all different risks because the different things are going to have different consequences and different likelihoods and different attack vectors. And the event even of data breach, are we talking about someone left a briefcase in the car? We're talking about a laptop stolen, we're talking about a firewall hack. What are we talking about here? And then we start looking, what's the asset, what's the consequence, what's the impact on objectives? So I still like risk matrices, but one caveat. And this risk matrix is a work in progress, it's an evolution. But essentially on the consequence asset, I've modelled here, much like probability. Probability, 0 to 1, so 0% to 100% or 0 to 1.0. I've done the same thing with consequence and said, okay, for this imaginary organisation, the net worth, the total asset base is as much as they can afford to lose. That's an existential threat. So, for example, if there's a company, it might be a total revenue. If you're a $1 billion a year company, then 1 represents $1 billion. And if you lose more than $1 billion, you've determined that that's your existential threat. You're out of business at that point. But we've got three risks modeled here. Now let's look at this risk B. I said, okay, for this hypothetical risk, there's a 30% likelihood that it will happen. Because we start to think about, it's like a slip, trip and fall. A simple example of someone falls over on this floor here. On a 5.5x5 matrix, number one is, nothing happens, they pick themselves up. Number two, they're bruised. Number three, they have a sprain and they, a couple of days off work. Number four, they're maybe, broken leg. And number five, they're dead because they cracked their head. All of these are possible, but they're not equally likely. And so what we're trying to do here is express that if a certain risk happens, if risk B happens, it's going to cap out at about 75% of the worst case, it's 75% cost. So it's not existential threat. But if it does occur, the most likely thing is it's going to be somewhere around 40 to 70% of our cost-based revenue, whatever you've chosen there. And you can do the same thing with lives and do the same thing with reputations and model. I've tried to use a numerical value here for simplicity. So I'd argue this is the kind of risk matrix we need to be thinking about. It's a combination of probability distribution and risk. So where are we? Dunning-Kruger effect. I put a post on LinkedIn recently about Dunning-Kruger effect. A couple of people may have come across this. And there's a fellow called David Dunning and Justin Kruger who did some of the early research which has since been verified, which simply says that there is this amazing effect where the less we know about a subject, the more confident we are. And this is like learning to drive. This is the model, when you learn to drive, when you're a kid, you go, I don't know anything about learning to drive. When you're at 15, you go, Dad's been doing it for years, Mum does it, it's easy, I've seen the bus driver does it. And then they put you behind the wheel and you go from this immense level of confidence to, clutch, brake, traffic, this is really more complicated. I'll never get this. Well, I'm starting to get the hang of it. And then when you do get a level of unconscious excellence, you realise that it is more complicated and you actually only know this much, but there's still that much more to know. Now, this is like media reporting, an IPCC report that tides, water levels will be 9 metres higher in 2040. Well, one of those guys goes back and reads the IPCC report or reads the research that they're talking about, and it often says something like, we expect with a 90% confidence interval that the tides will be between 1 metre and 9 metres, and with a mean likelihood of 3 metres. But the people who know the least about this stuff, the people who don't go and talk to the scientists, they believe the 9 metres, they will quote the 9 metres, they will tell you that this effect is definitely going to happen. And we may be familiar with the US elections. I think you see a lot of Dunning-Kruger going on there. And there's an element of education. We can overcome this, and we can overcome our bosses, our clients, our colleagues, Dunning-Kruger effect with security if we think about how to do it, if we give them the background, the education for the patient. And there's an element there of not just education but IQ, and people love the idea that it's high IQs, but we're a bit uncomfortable talking about low IQs. Like smart people are good, dumb people, we don't like to think about that. But in the real world, and I say this to you as security professionals because you change the world, however it feels, and however you might be doing this just for the money or starting out for the money, by protecting people. And Jeff spoke eloquently about protecting the travelling public. This is real world outcomes, and we need to think about how we do this. We also know that without being in any way judgmental or wanting to be dismissive, you actually need to realise that by definition, 50% of the population is below median IQ. And so you're not going to bring everybody along and say, this is a really good idea. You're going to end up with people rioting in the streets, and they're going to do that when they see fake news. They're going to do that, they're going to follow that when their livelihoods are threatened. If we see the potential pandemic, depression, this end of the pension, this demographic changes, fundamental change in the financial systems, we could be looking at, in all large extent, at the moment, there are $1.3 trillion worth of outstanding car loans in America. Now, there's 1.6 trillion in student loans, which can't be forgiven even if you go bankrupt. And if you go bankrupt, you still got to pay that 1.6 trillion worth of student loans back. Car loans right now, 1.3 trillion. That's about 110 million Americans. 5% of those loans are in arrears, but not a little bit in arrears. 90 days plus in arrears. And I want you to think about what it means when someone's car loan is in arrears. This is not the first loan you stop paying because you need your car to get a job, to get to work, to pay for the store card that you stop paying, to pay for the mortgage you stop paying. Now, we're facing potentially really tough times here. And maybe, we're facing a multilateral we've had this bilateral process of essentially the US versus the Soviets and with China, middle of last century. Then we moved into a unilateral world of the United States. Well, the United States is now in decline and other states are in ascendancy. We're facing a multilateral world of uncertainty. We're facing troubling times where people will start to act, they will start to believe bad news, they will start to act in this. So there's a whole connectivity going on in that area. Now, I'm going to wrap up. Mark's going to wrap up. He knows how famously long I can speak. So I've got a couple of questions for you. I've got a couple of things to give away. So first one is a copy of my latest book, Security Risk Management, A Memoir. Second one is this magnificent tactical pen. One of these pens, so one of these gifts could save your life, the other could potentially save your career. You choose which depends on your boss and your client. So I don't have a raffle, so I'm going to choose by asking you a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. So how can you contact me to download all these graphics in the presentation? Just kidding, I'll tell you that in a minute. So what was the problem that you had at the start? Does someone want to share that and ask a question relating to their particular problem? Because whoever you are, the first person to ask, get the choice of the book or the pen. Okay, John at the back.
So the issue you said was getting enough resources within my area getting enough resources in my area and to be able to move more from a reactive team to more proactive in respect to, you know, compliance with PSPF and all that sort of stuff. But we're in more of a monitoring, more of a proactive role as opposed to, you know, we're just day-to-day business as usual, reactive. But how do you convince, you know, management and executive that we need more resources, we need more ability in-house as opposed to relying on external capability. And
you've asked the question that I think everybody in this room could well resonate with. There's no simple version to getting more resources. However, I think if you can link in a risk assessment, if you can link what's going on with the business, even in terms of existing projects, with what you're doing in that, and show that link, you'll get firstly some good traction. There's also a great book which I'd encourage. It's one of the resources I'll give you in a moment. It's called Persuasion, and it's written by a fellow called Robert Cialdini, who spent years undercover, as he likes to put it, working in sales organisations. He's actually a behavioural psychologist and university lecturer. The book's very easy to read, but it gives us a lot of insight into how do we get, and you can't tell people what to think, but you can tell them what to think about. And that was the reason I asked you at the beginning to think about what was your real issue. Because if you start thinking about what's the biggest issue, it keys you in to the information it will feed. It gives you the context for this. So, you know, try not to think of a pink elephant. Now, Cialdini will give you, and you need to read the book in detail because it's quite a piece, but it's magnificent in many ways. A simple example, they did a test with a website selling furniture, and they wanted to see it change the background, we change the spending patterns. And so they had a hard wooden background, and then the next random samples, A/B testing, had a fluffy clouds. And lo and behold, without anybody being even slightly aware of the backgrounds or able to report on it, with a fluffy background, people went and bought softer, more expensive furniture. Dramatically changed. It even goes in, how do you change the room by putting posters in there? If you want your teams to be more productive, if you want managers to walk into your meeting room and think, oh, gee, I need to fund these guys more, the posters you put on the wall will change them. That's the, okay, so Joe, congratulations, I'll give you that. Oh, actually, which would you like? Do you want the pen or the book?
no,
Okay. Does anybody else have a problem with more resources? There you go, there's a book for you too.
I've got it.
You got it? Okay. Who else needs a book on more resources? Sol? Yep, done. Okay, so next question. So out of all this stuff, what was the best part of this presentation? And you're not allowed to say the end. That won't get you the tactical pen. So what stood out for you?
Kruger.
Yeah. Yeah, why?
It takes you through unconscious incompetence to conscious. Takes you through that journey, but it's just interesting the way that
So I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts and a chance for some questions if Mark gives me time. A colleague, Jason Brown, or a friend really, Jason Brown, who couldn't be here today because he was locked down in Victoria. said to me, I think very succinctly, risk management is future management. We are shaping the future. Now, this is not just a job when you work in security. We are actually influencing how the world is. And a lot of this stuff is going to be up to us. If we want more peace, prosperity, we want longevity, then we need to think about how we protect our people, our resources, our aviation, our network systems, all of that. So thank you. That's how you can find me. You can actually get a free copy of this book as a PDF if you go to that website, SRMAM, and you can download the presentations and graphics from there. So hopefully that was useful. Do we have any time for questions? No.
Sorry, we were sort of we're a bit down to the wire on that.
Okay, no problem.
So that's really excellent. Julian's obviously shown his continuing commitment to security professional development and the strategic level of thinking that he likes to engage in. And certainly from my point of view, his presentation drew attention to the fact that as security practitioners, we do have significant influence on the overall safety and security of society. And definitely from the SRM BOC point of view, Julian reinforces the fact that at the top level of our profession, we're actually management consultants specialising in asset protection. And those assets are personnel, information, equipment, reputation, and operational service capability. All right, we're getting the wind up now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but the camera's been taken away now, so whatever's
We're
going
all
on is
finished.
not being streamed.
Okay, that's all right. Well, on that note, I take great delight in presenting Julian with this certificate of appreciation. As you can see, it also acknowledges your previous achievement as a recipient of the prestigious Australian Security Medal. So thank you, and congratulations for your presentation. As I say, Julian will be around all day. He's a huge wealth of knowledge on enterprise security risk management and other practical issues as well. So try and buttonhole him, and I'm sure he won't.